Stained Glass is the most originally misunderstood Judas Priest record. And yeah, even more so than Nostradamus.
Can you believe that?
Released on the 10th of February in 1978, Stained Glass became the fourth studio record by the legendary UK heavy metal band Judas Priest. And so as a part of our Defenders of the Faith series, let's take a look at how this album actually might have saved. And not really only Judas Priest, but also Iron Maiden, Saxon, and many other heavy metal bands. Here you go. Very quick, before we start, guys, as always, please do not hesitate to comment on anything you hear or see in this video, and especially if you disagree with me, because the whole point of our Defenders of the Faith series is, of course, to start a conversation. But alright, let's do it. By the late 70s, heavy metal found itself in a rather dead-end situation. While some of the founders of the genre were somewhat struggling creatively, the attention of the entire music world was set on the rebellious punk rock movement, both in Europe and in the United States. And for Judas Priest, who have just released their third studio album and have finally gotten a deal with a major record label, well, this wasn't really the best news, as those were the times of make it or break it for the band, and possibly for the entire heavy metal genre. And we all know how it went. To help the band with their second album on the label, CBS Records invited producer Dennis McKay, who by then was known mostly for his work with jazz fusion and prog rock artists, which I guess kind of went against the whole idea of trying to catch up with the straightforwardness of punk rock.
But still, here we are.
It's funny how the boys throughout the years have always pointed out that they don't have that much recollection of the writing and recording process preceding Stained Glass, and I think I actually might know why. But the very first meeting the band had with Dennis McKay was back in spring of 1977, when the boys met, surprise, surprise, in a pub.
Well, let's have a party.
And since it was during those wild drinking days for Judas Priest, after 4 or 5 vodkas and countless pints of beer, the only question Rob wanted to know the answer to was how many pints Dennis can drink. And according to Glenn Tipton, his ability in that impressed them much more than his CV.
We're gonna have a good time. Always.
But either way, thus the choice was made, and half a year later, Judas Priest, together with Dennis McKay, entered the Chip and Norton studios in Oxfordshire to record what would become the most unique album in the entire Judas Priest discography. Upon entering the studio, it was immediately clear that this time it would be nothing like it was before. In their early days, Judas Priest of course were very short on finances, and thus simply could not allow themselves much time in the studio, as they actually had to pay for every minute of fooling around. Yet as the band was getting bigger and bigger, and by then not only in the United Kingdom but also in the United States and Japan, okay, let's be honest here, especially in Japan,
Judas Priest! Thank you very much.
money started to not really be an issue. And so with the band's newcomer drummer, Les Binks,
Good drummer. Great look, good drummer,
Good drummer.
who was the first to hit the studio, started the recording process, his enthusiasm, combined with Dennis McKay's perfectionism, resulted in them recording the drums for longer than it took Priest to record their entire debut record. With Les Binks stopping the recording process around every 20 minutes or so to retune his drum just to get the exact sound they wanted.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Les Binks.
And it is, of course, at least partially thanks to this perfectionism, combined with a masterful songwriting, of course, that on Stained Glass, Judas Priest were able to record such songs as, let's say, Exciter, which many actually believe to be the very first proper speed metal song recorded, and which both in terms of its sound and lyrically might actually be the grandfather of Painkiller. By the way, guys, this of course is not the first episode on Stained Glass on this channel, so I'm not going to go into the details of every song on this one, but please let me know in the comments which songs you would like me to dedicate specific episodes to, and also which is your favorite track on Stained Glass. Because for me, it is one of those albums on which it is pretty much impossible to choose one. same of course goes for both of the guitar parts and the bass lines on this record. With the bare exception of the solos, which were of course perfectly mapped out for Glenn Tipton, yet were absolutely improvised by K.K. Downing.
Can you believe that?
As the band continued recording this album, K.K. Downing would simply roam around the studio with his earphones on and improvise the solo parts on his guitar as the tape kept rolling, until he was able to spontaneously record that perfect lead break for his part. And we all know it turned out quite fine. Yet the most important stylistic change for Judas Priest on Stained Glass of course came on its rhythm section, where with the help of Les Binks' incredible drumming skills, the band was finally able to fully integrate the double bass drumming and make it an important part of their overall composition without it sounding too intrusive. Of course, with the band's founder and bassist Ian Hill making probably one of the most important decisions in his career, as it was in fact on Stained Glass when Ian Hill stopped playing bass with his fingers, which seemed natural to him, and switched to using a pick.
After all these years, I sort of find playing with the pick a bit awkward.
And by all means, this hasn't been done because Ian Hill was not able to keep up with the updated speed of Judas Priest, but rather to match the updated aggressive sound, and to be able to cut with his bass through the dueling guitars and make his bass sound as sharp and punchy as it was possible.
I did what was right, basically, for the song rather than me.
We all know how heavy metal suddenly became not cool for many in the 1990s. Yet, for some reason, we tend to forget that this wasn't really the first time it happened to our favorite music. By the late 70s, many bands tried to distance themselves as much as possible from the term heavy metal, even to the point of some of them getting angry at the interviews and insisting on them being called only hard rock or heavy rock instead.
Just like that.
And with the rising interest in the rebellious imagery and the straightforwardness of punk rock, many actually believed that it was the sunset for heavy metal, and that this genre would never survive the 1980s. And so what Judas Priest did on Stained Glass and later on perfected on Hellbent for Leather seemed impossible for most, as the band was actually able to combine the best of the two worlds, as Stained Glass in fact turned out as one of the darkest and the most sinister sounding albums, thus staying true to that heavy metal foundation laid back in Birmingham. Yet at the same time, instead of fighting it, actually embraced this straightforwardness and catchiness of punk rock, thus on one hand significantly shortening the average length of the songs on the album, yet at the same time, instead of denouncing, embracing the essence of the early heavy metal sound, and thus sharpening the heavy metal sword for the future generations. And I actually believe that if it was not for the new electric sound developed by Judas Priest on Stained Glass and later on perfected and completed by The Look on Hellbent for Leather, which by the way came out that same year, we would never have actually seen the prominent rise of first new wave of British heavy metal and later on all of those subgenres of metal which followed afterwards. Even though many of those new wave of British heavy metal bands existed before 1978, if we actually take a look at the evolution of their earliest demos and live performances before 1978 and afterwards, we can actually hear when that switch in their sound has occurred. And maybe that's why hundreds of the heavy metal musicians all around the world throughout the years were pointing out that it was in fact Stained Glass which has showed them how different heavy metal can sound, pushing the limits of what once was a very narrow genre and proving that heavy metal will never die. But anyways, thank you so much for watching the short video, guys. It was supposed to be much longer, but the fact that I had to spend some time in a bomb shelter, of course, shortened it a little bit. So here I just wanted to thank you guys all for all your support, for me, for this channel, and for Ukraine through this very, very difficult time. Just know that your support and support of the free world means the world to me and to every Ukrainian metalhead. We'll prevail. Slava Ukraini!